Testing 1 2. Testing 1 2. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. My name is Alex. I'm with the bookstore. We're delighted you're here with us this evening, and we hope you enjoy tonight's program with Mary Louise Kelly and Scott LaMar. Before we begin, of course, I have some quick housekeeping to go over. First, I'm excited to tease our very first event for the Harrisburg Book Festival. On Wednesday, October 18th, Steve Inskeep will be joining us in Harrisburg for the kickoff event at the festival to discuss his new book, Differ We Must, How Lincoln Succeeded in a Divided America. Again, that's on Wednesday, October 18th at 7 p.m. As always, take an events flyer as you leave, and stay tuned to our social media pages, website, and e-newsletter for updates, announcements, for events. Second, tonight's event would not have been possible without the support and partnership of WITF. We're so grateful for your presence here in Central Pennsylvania, and this program is being recorded to be re-aired at the Spark with Scott LaMar at a later date. I believe it is next Wednesday. Scott could announce that. WITF does have a merch table here tonight, so make sure to swing by, say hi, and grab something for the road. Once again, thank you to WITF for partnering with us on this program, and let's go ahead and give them a round of applause. Lastly, most importantly, we encourage you to come away with a copy of It Goes So Fast. Book sales are the bedrock of sustainability for our free author events, and every purchase helps support the bookstore, our staff, the author, and the future of our programming. Books are available for purchase up the cafe, and Mary Louise will be sticking around to sign copies of her book after the event. But at this time, it's my honor to introduce our speakers this evening. Scott LaMar has worked in both radio and television for more than 4 decades. Currently, LaMar is the host and executive producer of the Spark program on WITF-FM in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Previously, LaMar was WITF's TV's senior public affairs producer and produced the station's award-winning weekly public affairs TV program, Smart Talk. In addition to his on-air duties, LaMar has moderated political candidate debates, including those for candidates running for Pennsylvania governor and the U.S. Senate, and was a regular contributor to BBC World News TV before and after the 2020 U.S. presidential election. He has been nominated for 5 Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards, and LaMar have been recognized in the Central Pennsylvania community. Of course, yeah. Of course, our featured author tonight is Mary Louise Kelly. Mary Louise has been reporting for NPR for nearly 2 decades and is now co-host of All Things Considered. She is the author of articles and essays that have appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, among numerous other publications. A Georgia native, Kelly graduated from Harvard University with degrees in government and French language and literature, and completed a master's degree in European studies at the University of Cambridge in England. She created and taught a graduate course on national security and journalism at Georgetown University. In addition to her NPR work, Kelly has served as a contributing editor at The Atlantic, moderating newsmaker interviews at forums from Aspen to Abu Dhabi. Of course, Mary Louise's new book is titled It Goes So Fast, The Year of No Do-Overs. Ann Patchett writes, quote, "It Goes So Fast is a moving and funny account of the deals we cut with ourselves, what we sacrifice, what we gain, and what we really want." Mary Louise Kelly gives us tremendous insight into how we struggle to be true to ourselves and the people we love, and how we're never going to get it exactly right. This book is a gift, end quote. We're so very honored to welcome Mary Louise Kelly and Scott LaMar to Harrisburg. So without further ado, please join me in giving them a warm round of applause.
Well, Mary Louise, welcome to Harrisburg.
Thank you. I am so happy to be here. Thank you all for coming out on a beautiful night. I'm embarrassed to tell you that this is my first time in Harrisburg, and I live in DC, which, as you know, is only 2.5 hours. So I'm glad to finally have an excuse to come out, and I'm honored to be here on the stage with you. Thank you, Scott.
Well, thank you very much for being with us. You know, I have heard so many people say over my lifetime, it goes so fast when they're talking about their children or they're talking about their own lives. But I have to say, after reading the book, perfect title. It is a perfect title. I don't know if I could ever find a book that title fits so well.
I deserve zero of the credit for it. I wrote the sentence, which is in the opening chapter, punctuated the way it ended up on the cover, because it goes so fast. So I did write that, and then I had all these other ideas for a title, which my publisher and editor wisely told me were wrong. I toyed with "In the Time We Have Left," and she said that sounds like death.
Yeah.
Like, I'm so depressed.
I'm with you on that.
I had various other bad contenders until she finally overruled all of them and said, what if we just take that sentence from the chapter? It goes so fast. That's the point. And I thought, yeah, that's the point.
Yeah. And, well, as I said, it's a perfect title. You didn't intend to write this book, did you?
No.
Tell the story, if you would, of how the book actually came about.
I did not intend to write this book. I never was planning to write a memoir. It feels like something you should be quite aged and wise to do, and I didn't feel like I was there. But I was thinking on a quote that I put at the beginning of the book from the great Toni Morrison, which is, if there is a book you want to read and no one has written it, then you must write it. And I'm a writer. And there was a book that I really wanted to read because there was something very much on my mind. And as far as I could tell, nobody had really tackled it head on. The dilemma that I was staring down coming up on 2 years ago now was, the entire time I have been a mother, I have been a journalist. Some days those two things fit together well. The majority of days I'm hanging on by my toenails and cannot be in two places at once. I've wrestled with that, as many of us have. The impossibility of being in two places that you absolutely need to be at once. But it came to a head in the fall of 2021. My oldest son, who loves soccer, has lived for soccer since before he could walk. He would have been like crawling along the front here, batting a little Nerf soccer ball. He was going out for his varsity team, and their games are weekdays at 4:00, and this is what he lives for. He lives for these games, and I have a conflict on weekdays at 4:00, which is to the minute. It's when All Things Considered goes on air. This had been the case for years. He made the varsity team as a freshman and as a sophomore and as a junior, and I had missed all the games freshman year, sophomore year. But I was suddenly staring down senior year, and the choices that I had wrestled with, I never took them lightly. But I always thought there's a chance I'll make a different choice next time. Like next year, I'm going to figure this out. And I suddenly, instead of thousands or hundreds of games, I could count them on my two hands. There just weren't that many. There weren't that many left. And I realized if I'm going to make a different choice, I got to do it right now. And I did, and I took an extended absence from NPR. So if you didn't hear me much in the fall of 2021, that's why. I was going to soccer games. And the act of deciding to do that and the impact it had on my career and how I thought about it led me to think about all the decisions I'd made that has gotten us there and what the impact on my family and me has been. So I started writing and ended up writing his senior year, 2021, 2022, in real time, what those choices looked like for our family, and trying to juggle wanting to be good at my job, a job that gives me purpose and that I love, and wanting to be a good mom, and realizing these things are coming into conflict and something's got to give.
Did James is the son that you're referring to, your older son, Alexander is your younger son, who is trying out for the varsity soccer team right now, right?
Like as we speak,
Okay.
He is in tryouts. Yeah.
Did James appreciate that you were at the games?
Did James appreciate that I was at the games? That's such a good question. There were games that I went to, and some games he would trot over and meet me on the sidelines afterward, but others the team is going into meetings in the locker room, and I wouldn't see him till we got home. And he would show up at our dinner table and report the score and tell me about the highlights. And I'd look at him and say, I was there. I saw that goal. And he, oh, you were there? I thought, yes, I was there. But yeah, I think he knew. and I think he appreciated it, and I think he got it.
Did he play better when you were there?
I don't think it had any impact whatsoever. And one of my realizations was, I think he knew. I think he knows. I think it matters. I am busy organizing my fall schedule now, and you will hear me a little bit less on all things considered for September, October, November, because I'm trying to organize to be there for Alexander's games. I think they know, but one of the things that hit home to me as I was writing this was the boys were fine either way. They were going to score or not score either way. They were fine, and they were actually quite happy to come home and report it to me at dinner. I was the one who missed it and who realized I'm not going to get this back, and it matters to me.
Was it just soccer, or were there other things in James' senior year that things you had missed through the first 11 years that you were looking forward to? I mean, soccer, now granted, he played travel soccer. I think he wrote that he was playing almost all year round.
Yeah.
But varsity high school soccer was just in the fall.
Yeah. True. So I'll give an example. I've always been focused on foreign affairs and national security, and that means my work trips reporting tend to be overseas and often to war zones. And I went to Ukraine last February, right as Russian troops were all lined up at the border but had not yet crossed, and reported from there and anchored all things considered from there. And it was one of the more rewarding assignments I've ever done for a number of reasons. It was a phenomenal reporting trip where the stakes just felt so high, and the stakes of getting it right and trying to convey to all of you, this is what's happening. This is why we need to care. Imagine what that feels like to have a family. Like, if I thought I was stressed, any of us are stressed, like, try juggling work and kids and family and what's going to be for dinner, and there are Russian tanks lined up about to invade your city. I mean, it puts it in perspective, but trying to figure out how do I find the stories that are going to bring that home as this country debates to what extent we should be involved in sending aid or sending weapons. That really felt like it mattered, and I had done a lot of reporting, never from Ukraine before, but from Russia. So I knew the story and was deeply invested in it. I came back when I rotated out, and Layla Fadl from Morning Edition rotated in, and my editors asked me to go back. This was late spring of last year. The war is catastrophic, and that was when we were seeing streams of refugees crossing the border. It felt so important to go back and pick up those stories, but it was spring of senior year, and James is staring down his final exams, and it's prom. And again, did James care if I was around for prom? Like, not really, frankly, but I cared, and I wasn't ever going to get senior spring back. And when you accept an assignment like Ukraine, you can't guarantee I'll be back a week from Thursday for prom. Like, you don't know what the transport and logistics and coverage are going to look like. You might, Layla went in and she was there for a good month and then got COVID, and then they wouldn't let her come back. It was a nightmare. So I said no. And I'm not sure I would have made that decision freshman year, but you hit a point. I feel like for the big moments, the big birthdays, the big camp drop off, whatever it was, when my kids really needed me and it was a clearly big moment, I was there. I did show up. The soccer game, it's such a good example because that felt less black and white. It felt really gray. The stakes aren't that high if I miss a soccer game next Tuesday, because there are going to be more. But you add up all of those little decisions, and it's the life you're choosing. And the life you're choosing for your family, and what you're prioritizing, and what choices they see you making. And it sounds frivolous to sit up here and say I turned down an assignment in Ukraine so that I could be there to make sure my son knew how to, pin the corsage on, but it mattered. And to me, it was the right choice.
Well, it's a memory that you and him will have for the rest of your lives.
Yeah.
So Ukraine would have been too, but still, it's a little different.
And the other thing, as we all know, sadly, there will always be another war to cover. There will always be another hurricane. There will always be another election. There will always be. and there are other journalists who can cover them. But there's no one else who can be mom on prom night to my boy, and it felt like it mattered.
I asked a few minutes ago whether James appreciated you being at soccer games, but there is one part in the book where you write that you were away for a weekend. And I can't remember, did he call or text?
He called.
He called, asking you to move the car out of the driveway so he could get out. And you hadn't been home for 3 days.
Mhm.
So that made you kind of rethink. What did you think at that point?
This is as I am writing this book, so I am literally so focused on being home and present and counting like the number of family dinners we have left. Reading a book about it, and yes, I had been in Georgia. I grew up in Georgia. My family's there, and I'd flown down for my baby brother's birthday. And I had been gone, I think it was 3 days, and James was calling saying, "Mom, I have SAT tutor, like I have to move right now. Why can't you move the car?" Well, because I am in Georgia, not Washington, and I have been we're coming up on 4 days. Like, did you actually not only not miss me, but not even notice? So it does put it in perspective. And the kicker is it was his father's car, and his father was in the house. So why the call didn't go to his father first, that's a different conversation.
Kids always seem to go to mom first. You write that in the book, right?
The default is mom.
The default is mom.
The school nurse always calls mom.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you're very self-reflective in this book. You talk about your parents. In fact, I'm hoping that we don't have a Huguenot moment here. You could explain that, but you talk about your parents throughout the book as well.
Yeah. Well, because I was wrestling with what it means to be a parent and what we pass on, and I know was instructive to look up as well at what was passed on to me and what I got from my parents and how they had showed up for me. Very different choices that my mother has made in her life. She did not work outside the home when I was growing up, and has been 100% supportive of my decisions, has been texting me in the drive up here to try to figure out which weekend she can come up for soccer games when I have to travel. And it's now Alexander, and he's 17, and he's fine for a night, but she's still holding down the fort and making sure I can be out there doing what I need to do and want to do. The Huguenots moment was my father, who I lost also in this formative year, lost to cancer when he'd battled cancer for 14 years. And as I was thinking about what he had passed on to me, one of the things was an encyclopedic knowledge of the Huguenots. If you would like to know more about the Huguenots, like a lot more about the Huguenots, my father would happily hold court up here for at least an hour or more.
But you and your brother had a running joke about that.
My father also, among his many wonderful qualities, he lacked the ability to tell when you had lost the will to live, because he had gone on for so long about something and your eyes are rolling back in your head and cobwebs are growing off you. And the Huguenots was one example of many. Like, don't ask I remember one friend of my brother's who was riding to the movies with us one night, and he made the mistake of saying, "Mr. Kelly, what's a Mormon?" And I looked at my mother, and we both went, "Oh God!" And it was like 2 hours, but we got the whole history of the Church of Latter-day Saints. Because I don't know, my father was not Mormon. I don't know how he knew so much about the Mormons or the Huguenots. He was not a Huguenot either. Anyway, my brother uses it. My brother and I use it for code. And if I occasionally am going on too long with a story at the dinner table, my brother will kind of lean over and say, "Huguenots." And I know it's time to wrap it up and move on.
All right, so during this year that James was a senior, and you were focused so much on his senior year, soccer, so much going on in your life, Mike Pompeo intrudes, and former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and I see a lot of people nodding their heads, you know what I'm talking about. So let's hear exactly what happened with the former Secretary of State.
He was then the current Secretary of State in office under President Trump, and I had been asking for an interview with him for a while. And they finally got me on his schedule. I found out while I was in Iran, reporting from Iran and interviewing his counterpart, the foreign minister in Iran. And the State Department called and said, we have 10 minutes on his calendar. So when you get 10 minutes with the Secretary of State, there's like 8,000 things you want to ask. There's so many things you want to ask a sitting Secretary of State. But in that moment, I was in Iran, and the reason I was in Iran was we had nearly gone to war with Iran that month. The U.S. had assassinated General Qasem Soleimani, and Trump was threatening missile strikes on Tehran. And so we were covering that news, and obviously I wanted to ask our Secretary of State, what's the plan for Iran? How are we going to stop them from getting a nuclear weapon? And is there any plan for diplomacy? Like, where does this go? But the other thing that was happening that month was we were in the middle of the Senate impeachment trial for President Trump. The first one, we didn't know it was going to be the first one, but the first one to do with Ukraine. And all of the people testifying as key witnesses were diplomats or national security officials who worked for Mike Pompeo. Mike Pompeo had been on the famous call with Zelensky where Trump said, I just want you to do us a favor. So there was, in other words, there was no way you could sit down with Mike Pompeo in that moment and not ask about Ukraine. So we did the interview. We started with Iran. It was contentious. It was a testy interview from the start, and got more so when I changed the subject to Ukraine, which he did not want to talk about, to the extent that his staffer cut the interview short before the full 10 minutes. And I thanked him, as is customary to do, and he said nothing, just leaned close and glared at me, and then left the room. And so my team and I are packing up to head back to file, and the same staffer came and got me and brought me back to, we're on the 7th floor of the State Department in Washington, and brought me back to his living room adjacent to his office, and he screamed at me for about the same amount of time as the interview, and asked, forgive my language, but if I'm going to quote accurately, do you think Americans care about fucking Ukraine? And I said, yes. Could you even find Ukraine on a fucking map? And I said, yes. And so he had his aides bring in a map, a like unmarked map, no borders, no writing, no countries, marked, just blobs of land masses, continents, and I pointed to Ukraine. And he said, people will hear about this. And I agreed that they would. And I thanked him again and left. Our plan going into the interview had been that if he made news, we would, this was in the morning. I think the interview was at 9 a.m. And we have a booth at the State Department where we can file from. And my producer had already run and started uploading the tape, and I went live on Morning Edition and described the interview. I did not immediately talk about the map test because I was trying to figure out, I'm not in this business to embarrass someone. And I thought that part of the interview was on the record, but it wasn't on tape. And I thought, if he denies this, because it's so surreal, if he denies this, am I going to get into a he said, she said thing with the Secretary of State? There was one other person in the room, his staffer, who worked for him. But the main thing was just thinking, is this newsworthy? What's the value in reporting this? And I ended up thinking, about one of those bright lines that has guided me in difficult decisions in journalism over decades now, which is just say what you know and how you know it, and y'all can make up your mind what you want to think about it. It felt newsworthy because it spoke to how little he seemed to value the relationship with Ukraine, that, a foreign policy relationship that then as now was dominating the national conversation. And it spoke to how our top diplomat conducts himself behind closed doors. So I called the State Department and said we would we plan to air the interview in full, no edits at all, not even an or an nothing edited, and that I planned to report the map test portion of the interview. And did he want to add any comment or context? And they did not. So we aired the interview in full, and it made headlines worldwide. And then the next day, he put out a statement on State Department letterhead calling me a liar and suggesting that I had pointed to Bangladesh. And I will only say Bangladesh is on a different continent. It is thousands of miles away from Ukraine, and I'll leave it there. And I will also say I wish him well. I have no beef with Mike Pompeo. He's a smart guy. I wish him well.
What was it like covering the Trump administration? Because I mean, from what we've all heard, it was unlike anything anyone in your position, any national media had ever covered.
It's true. It was unlike covering any other administration that I have in Washington, Republican or Democratic. It was interesting in a way. We had great access. The Trump administration would give us interviews. I mean, I was getting the Secretary of State on the record. We had senior officials from the White House on air, so the problem wasn't access either in getting interviews or in understanding what Trump was thinking, because he tweeted constantly, like we knew what he was thinking. It was challenging in that you could get a very senior source, and it wasn't always clear that they were speaking for Trump. If you get President Biden's national security advisor or CIA director or State Department or Secretary of State, you may like or not like what they're telling you. You can agree or disagree with the policy, but you're fairly clear that they are speaking for Biden and that Biden isn't going to tweet something completely contradictory to what they have just told you. Covering Trump, that was not the experience. And you could speak to very senior people in the White House who would tell you this is the plan, and then Trump would go and do something totally different. So if you're trying to parse what's the plan on Iran, are we about to bomb Iran or not, there was really only one source, and it was Trump.
So one of the things that Donald Trump was most successful at was sowing mistrust in media. Fake news was, from the time he walked down the escalator in 2015, he would say fake news. Has NPR experienced that mistrust? Have you personally had any occasion where someone says, "Oh, you're fake news"?
Sure. Yeah. I think anybody working in the media, local or national, has experienced. And I think part of this is polarization and paths we were going down already. We were already in 2016 in a moment where people didn't all sit down and watch Cronkite at 6 o'clock on their TVs and have the same set of working facts. We were already in our silos. There's plenty we have learned. I will say I don't speak for my newsroom, but speaking for myself, and plenty we're still trying to figure out as we gear up for what looks like another. The word unprecedented and uncharted waters are overused, but I think we're heading into another season where I've never seen anything like it. A four-time indicted president a former president trying to be president again, being in and out of court during the primaries. I don't, it will be a challenge to cover and to do so in a way that we're helping our audience. We've changed some things at NPR and are continuing to consider. Two of the things I'll mention are, like most broadcast news organizations, if the President of the United States called a news conference, we carried it live. because it was going to be newsworthy. And we do not carry Trump live anymore. And we're thinking hard about, okay, if that's going to be the standard for Trump, what's the standard for Biden? Like, how do we navigate this? The challenge with Trump is, again, whatever your politics, he says things that are not true, and it's very difficult in real time to, like, what do? Mute him and say that's not true. Fact check, see our website. You can do it before, you can do it after, you can do the truth sandwich that journalists talk about here are the facts, then let's hear him, now let's fact check it. But people tune in and tune out and they don't hear the fact check. So we are not airing stuff live. We're covering Trump. We're at Mar-a-Lago. We'll be covering all of the indictments. We'll be reporting what he says. We'll be interviewing his team. I just interviewed his attorney. And my colleague just interviewed the attorney who's going to be representing him in the federal indictment on January 6th. We're covering it and hearing these voices because it's important to hear what's going on, but we're not doing him live. The other thing we're doing is just trying to tell you more of this, being more transparent about, okay, we're not taking Trump's news conference live, and here's why. And you can agree or disagree and think that's journalistic malpractice or a pinnacle of journalistic excellence. That's fine. That's within your right. But we're trying to explain to you, we're doing our best. These are the decisions we're making. Here's why. Here's why we're using this language. Here's why we're covering this. Here's where we have decided to assign reporters and why. And my hope is, I get that doesn't fix every problem, but that being transparent about we're genuinely trying to do our best. Here's the basis for the coverage decisions we're making, that will go some way toward building trust. We're people, we're doing our jobs, we're doing our best.
Let me segue into this next question by providing a little context. I'm asked often, and I'm sure you are, who would your dream interview be? Who would you love to talk to? And the reason I provide this context is because normally I would say the President of the United States, but with Trump, Steve Inskeep probably did the best interview with Trump that I heard, and Trump hung up on him and ended the interview and got questions he didn't like. But that's the context. I still haven't figured out who my favorite interview would be. What about you?
I would love to interview Trump.
You would?
I'd be happy to interview Trump.
How? That's the big thing.
Yeah. Well, and Steve provided a great model.
Yeah.
I have not interviewed Zelensky and would love to. We're working on that. I have not interviewed Bradley Cooper, and if any of you have an in, I'm down.
I did figure out who I wanted to interview finally, Paul McCartney. So if you're going to do Bradley Cooper, I'm going to do Paul McCartney.
I have interviewed Paul McCartney.
Have you?
He's lovely.
Ah.
Absolutely lovely. I asked him, I interview a lot of big names because that comes with the territory, and I don't often get starstruck, but it's Paul McCartney.
Yeah.
And you also feel the pressure of, I don't want him to be bored, and he's done so many interviews. Like, what can you possibly ask Paul McCartney that he hasn't been asked? I wasn't trying to ask him something to throw him off guard, but as I was going through listening to all the old songs and thinking about the ones I loved, they were all love songs, and many of them were written during the period that he was married to Linda McCartney, who he was married to for 20-something years until she died of breast cancer, and he's now happily married, by all accounts, to a lovely woman. But I asked him, sometimes do you still sing to Linda? Particularly when you're singing those songs that you wrote to her. And there was a long pause where I could feel him trying to figure out what to say. And I love those moments that I'm sure you have as an interviewer where you can tell someone is trying to figure out what they think in real time. And he finally said no. I write those songs, and I did write them for Linda, but now they're out in the world. And he said, what was it? Something beautiful. They're like birds, and once you write them, they're out in the world, and they fly away. It's beautiful.
It really is. So let's get back to James and the senior year. Pompeo was in February, right?
January.
January. Okay, so
January.
I knew it was early in the year. Were you counting the days to James' graduation? I mean, you said you were counting soccer games,
Hmm.
but what about the days to his graduation?
I think I wasn't counting days so much as experiences. I was counting, like, maybe not counting, like ticking them off, but I would set the table for family dinner and think, how many more nights? And they come home, as those of you with older kids know, or they come back, but it's never going to be quite the same as that nuclear family where you're all under one roof. So I think I was focused on that, but also focused on the beauty of those moments. I In what might have been my very first interview about this book, I was speaking to my colleague Scott Simon. It was my NPR interview for Weekend Edition, and Scott was asking me about lasts, and I write in the book about, like, the earlier lasts, like the last time your kid crawls onto your lap for a cuddle. And you, of course, never know in the moment this is going to be the last time because they're 11 or 12 and they're about to be taller than me, but sometime it's going to be the last one. And I hadn't thought about it. I don't write about it in the book, but I have a very, very strong memory of the last time I nursed a baby, my youngest, Alexander. And he was about 10 months old and losing interest, and my supply was drying up, and I knew we were tapering, but I remember very specifically, like, where we were in the house and the sun coming through the windows and holding him and thinking, I think this is the last time, and I'm not going to have more. So I think this is it. And it's been so beautiful. I've loved doing this. And I said to Scott, you can let that break your heart, or you can let it lift it up and think, how beautiful is this? And I felt those moments a lot, James's senior year.
You know, I met you for the first time tonight in person. Of course, after reading the book and hearing you every day, I feel like I know you. But you're getting emotional just talking about it.
I feel it. I There are chapters in this book that you will never read because I wrote them and then thought, this doesn't need to be out in the world. I needed to write this, but I don't need to put this out in the world. There are a couple of chapters that are not in there because my boys had veto power and were asked to read these chapters, the ones where they feature prominently. And I said, if there's anything you don't like for whatever reason, it's gone. And there were a couple things that wouldn't even have occurred to me to be the things they might be sensitive about, but they said, could we not? And I said, fine, it's gone. But it didn't feel worth writing unless it felt real and cut a little close to the bone. And so that's what I wrote.
One of the most emotional chapters in the book was something that happened during this year, and it had to do with Alexander. That Alexander did not have an easy birth. You know the chapter I'm talking about, the envelope.
Yeah.
That is very unusual, obviously, for how old was he? He was 15 then?
He was 15 when I was writing. He's 17 now.
Right, but there was an envelope about all the health problems that Alexander had when he was born, and you kept the envelope sealed for those 15 years.
I was so tired when he came home from the hospital. I didn't have the energy to open it, so I think I threw it in the file drawer and it sat there for 15 years.
But what did you say when you opened it?
Alexander had beyond a difficult birth. He was born not alive, and I had known it was a very difficult birth. I have scars all up and down my stomach that testified to that. But I was unconscious, mercifully, for the latter part of it, and didn't know the details that were documented in this envelope. And the chapter is titled Zero. I was going through trying to fact check something else in the book, and so I was going through his early childhood files and found this envelope that had never been opened, and innocently thought, I've lived without knowing what's in there for this long. I'll just open it, scan it, and chuck it in the bin, move on. And I read it, and The 0 is, as you all may know, with a newborn, they give an APGAR score to. It's a score of 1 to 10, and it's measuring, I can't remember exactly, but it's how healthy they are. Are they breathing? Are they pink? Do they have reflexes? What's their pulse? And 10 is a perfect score, and 1 is the low end of the scale. And Alexander was 0, and he was 0 for a few minutes after birth. And I didn't know that. And I was reading this, and he was home, and he was 15, and he's healthy. He is a varsity athlete. He's strong. He's a 10. But it is very difficult to read about your child as a 0, as being not alive, even knowing that the story has a happy ending. And I wrote about it because it felt relevant in thinking about the choices I have made since, and thinking, if I had known that, would I have been on the road as much as I was when he was little? Would I have made a different choice if I'd known like how close we came to losing him? And I wrestle with that, and I do still.
You said that the boys had veto power. What did Alexander think of that? Was that the first time he learned of it as well?
Yeah.
And what did he think of it?
It's in the book, so he was okay with me putting it out there. I think he was much more pragmatic about, well, that was then, and I'm fine, and I was, fine from early childhood, so I'm okay. The story that James wrestled with that is in the book is the one you asked me about, when he was in Georgia and didn't notice I'd been gone. And he read that and said, "Mom, I look like such a jerk. Is America going to cancel me if you put this out there?" And I said, "I don't think America will cancel you. I think they'll think it's funny. You're a teenage boy."
Well, you can tell him. Has he left for school yet?
James is at University of Chicago. He just finished his freshman year. He loved it. He's happy. And they start really late. They're on the quarter system, so he doesn't go back for another couple of weeks.
Okay. Well, so he's still at home over the summer.
He is at the beach right now, living his best life.
Well, what I was going to
But yes, he is home.
You can tell him that the audience in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania laughed when we told the story.
Thank you.
So he wasn't canceled.
Thank you.
So we're going to be opening opening this up for questions for Mary Louise in just a moment. But I want to talk about that. I guess you could say a final question. What stands out to you about that year? Was Paul McCartney like that?
Was what?
Was Paul McCartney like that?
Silent.
Yeah, okay.
I write about silence, and that sometimes you have to let a question sit when you ask somebody.
Yeah.
Let it just sit, and sometimes you may get one of the more telling answers of your interview if you let them wrestle with it for a second, because they're about to tell you something they hadn't figured out already. I've talked about how I hadn't fully processed the importance of the decisions that are in the gray, as I put it, all the little ones that don't seem consequential in the moment. I feel relief. I know how lucky I am. My boys are healthy. They turned out fine. Whatever my mistakes, and I made many, they're fine, and I know how fortunate I am. I look back and think I was very hard on myself, and I still am. And I write one chapter about running into another reporter, a fellow young mother, when I was a young mother and Alexander was very small, and she was a competitor at another news organization. And I won't tell the whole story, but long story short, I ran into her at a moment where I was taking a long break from work, and I wasn't sure I would ever go back because Alexander needed me, and I was home with him for a year. And I ran into her, and she was in this fabulous suit, and she was off to the White House to do this interview, and I cried after I ran into her because I just thought, I have thrown away my career. What am I doing? She didn't recognize me. That was the killer detail. She didn't recognize me, and I thought, I'm not sure I recognize myself. What am I doing? And the next time I saw her, some period of time later, she told me she had cried in the taxi ride to the White House, thinking, I looked so happy and was with my son, and it was a beautiful morning, and we're going to the playground. She was like, I was stuffed into Spanx going to do this interview and totally stressed out on deadline, and I dropped my own toddler at daycare so a stranger could take her to the park on this beautiful morning. And she said, I went the whole rest of the day thinking, what am I doing with my life? And I said, I spent the whole day in the playground thinking, what am I doing with my life? And I thought, we're so hard on ourselves. I extend so much grace to her, and I assume she's a brilliant mom when she gets home from that interview, and I'm sure she is. And she extended so much grace to me, and I am trying, and it's a work in progress, but to lighten up a little bit, to think the boys are going to be okay or not okay, and much of it is outside my control, particularly now that, their ages now. And extending the same grace to myself that I would extend to any of you or to a colleague or to a friend. Because why not?
I'm sure you have questions. Alex, you want to raise your hand?
Please.
If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and I'll come around with the mic. We'll start here, then go.
Hi.
Hi, Mary Louise. Thank you for being here. Scott, thank you for being here. This is awesome. Question about when you prep for interviews. I'm curious how many of the questions or how much do you write out ahead of time? How much of it is in the moment? And do you have a go-to question that you rely on when the interview maybe isn't going as well as it should be?
Great question. I will say, my job, I anchor a show called All Things Considered, and that we take it really, the mission quite seriously. So on any given day, I can be doing interviews about basketball and the federal deficit and, the Republican primary and, the pandemic. It's all over the place. I mentioned that because each day, each interview is preparing me for the next thing. When I'm going to interview Mike Pompeo, I'm not starting from scratch because I just came from Iran where I just interviewed the foreign minister there, and prepping for that is giving me what I need to prep for Pompeo and interviewing the, senator on the Foreign Affairs Committee right before I left. And, so each interview, I like to think of as a conversation, and it's a running conversation. So every interview I do, I'm using to inform the next one and hopefully pull you along. That said, before a big interview, like a big newsmaker interview, I do a lot of homework. I will walk in, like with Pompeo, I think it's only like 3 questions written down. Because in 10 minutes, that's what you're going to have time for, because each question, you're going to have to follow up and push and clarify and fact check. So when I say I go in with 3 questions, yes. But had I made sure I'd talked to, the diplomat who had just resigned in protest, who may or may not want to be quoted on the record, but I know what they've said, and I'm saying, what would you ask him? What feels important? If he says this, what, so it's almost, I ask something, I'm trying to think, what are they likely to say? What am I going to need to push for? I don't have a go-to question. I often find the most revealing questions are just the really simple, basic ones. So I'll do all the prep. I've read everything there is to be read about Iran and Ukraine before I walk in to interview Mike Pompeo. But I always make sure to find a few minutes to think, what do I actually just really want to know? What do I want to know? That only he could answer. And I ask it. And it's amazing how often I don't hear that in interviews. People ask really smart, informed, intelligent questions, but not just the basic one on your mind. And to me, the more successful interviews are when I succeed, and I certainly don't succeed every time, but at channeling, just like, what would you all want to know? What do you actually want to know? That's what I need to ask. And if he doesn't answer it, I need to push and ask again.
Thank you, Mary Louise and Scott, for sharing your evening with us. And if you haven't read the book, it actually goes so fast. I have kind of a 2-part question. You wrote the book in acts. So the first part is, were there any stories that got cut from your act that you wish had made the book? And as you're now living Act 3, are there any stories you wish to preview for us for Act 3?
Thank you. There are plenty of stories. Some, as I say, I wrote because I needed to get them out of my system and then decided I don't need to put this out in the world. Some I wrote or started to write and then realized I like this story, but I don't think it belongs in this book. Someday I'll tell that in some forum, but it's not part of this year or informing the decisions I made this year. And I wanted this book, I wanted it to go so fast. Like I wanted it to be this didn't need to be a 700-page tome with every story. You can have one that illustrates the point. So there's plenty that hit the cutting room floor. The acts you refer to, I write at the beginning and again at the very end. I have found it sometimes an interesting exercise to think of life as a play. And if you were writing your life as a play, how many acts would it be? Where would the curtain open? Like what would be happening? How many characters do you need? Like what does this look like? And it was useful in writing this book because Act 1 for me is basically my whole youth, school, college, getting married, getting my first job, my first car, like all of that was Act 1 because then kids came and that was Act 2 and that kind of so utterly transformed life that it was deserving of its own space. And I'm always going to be a mom. That's not ending, obviously, but childhood is ending in our house. And I'm about to be able to go to Ukraine with no guilt and no worries about, who's going to show up for soccer games or what's for dinner tonight or who's walked the dog or any of it. And so I am thinking about Act 3. What chapters may be next. I will say I just re-upped my contract at NPR, so y'all are stuck with me for at least a few more years. I am noodling the next book, and it's going to be fiction, I think. So I'm going to go meet my editor in New York next month and talk through a couple of ideas and have her like slap sense into me and tell me that's totally unpromising, but here's this other thing. And so we'll kick it around. That's part of the process that's fun. And I haven't really talked about this and wasn't planning to talk about it, but I will say if you've read the book, you get I'm an ambitious person and always have been in my work. And I still feel that. Like, I still feel really driven. I want to get back to Ukraine. But I increasingly feel ambitious about other things, about being a good mom and being a good friend. My college roommate is here tonight and drove up with me, and I want to show up for my friends and my family in ways that I have not always been able to when I have been so all in professionally. And I don't know how re-upping my NPR contract and deciding to write a new book is going to contribute to fulfillment of that goal, but I am thinking about what redefining ambition might look like in this Act 3.
Thank you. I also really enjoyed the book. And one of the things that stuck with me is how unapologetic you are at times about putting your career not ahead of your family, but really putting your passion central in the life that you led up into the time that you were writing the book. But at the same time, you make reference to the school nurse always calling the mom first. And so I was wondering how you did that and how you thought about the importance of your own passions within your family.
Thank you. I spoke a moment ago about I'm well aware of how lucky I am that my boys are healthy and happy and fine. I also am very aware of how lucky I am in being able to make the choices I make. It's a privilege. But the third thing I would say that speaks directly to what you're asking is I've always known what I wanted to do. Not every step, obviously, but I founded a newspaper for my suburban cul-de-sac in suburban Atlanta when I was 11 or 12. And then I edited my high school paper, and then I did my college paper, and my first big job out of college was an intern in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, my hometown paper. my first big story was a sinkhole that opened in the Wolf Camera parking lot on 14th Street and in an awesome development swallowed a pickup truck. And it was like big. My story was not remotely newsworthy or well written, but the picture was awesome. So it made the front page with my byline on the front page. And I just thought, this is what I was born to do. I'm here. I made it. I have, Scott, you and I were talking right before we came out about just, I have good days and bad days at my job, as anyone does. But at the heart, the ability to talk, it's like Paul McCartney is fun, but talking to just ordinary people about what is happening in their lives, it's true, it is genuinely such a privilege, and I can't believe I get to wake up and do it every day, and that all of you are listening. Like, that's just the coolest thing in the world. And I don't think I would be so agonized about my choices if I didn't love my job and feel a sense of purpose in it. And I know I'm lucky for that. And so that has informed some of the just some of the decisions I have made to prioritize work and not be ashamed about it. It feels like it matters. I'm under no illusion that I'm saving the world every day, but the work feels like it matters, and it still does. And when that stops feeling that way, I'll find something else to do. But that's just always the way I felt and still do.
Did you ever have, just kind of a follow-up
Yeah.
on that, did you ever have anyone who said, well, okay, a woman has to make a choice, mother or career? Have you ever had anyone voice that to you? Or
my first boss at NPR, who is a woman and had chosen not to be a mother because she didn't feel like she could do both well. We were introduced with a quote by Ann Patchett, who interviewed me in her bookstore, Parnassus Books in Nashville, about this book. Anne is very upfront about she is not a mom because she didn't think she could be good at writing and be good at being a mom at the same time, and something had to give. So I have not only been told that, but I'm aware that very smart, accomplished women who I respect have felt that to be true in their lives and have made decisions that have guided that. So sure, absolutely. And you know what? Like, I totally respect that choice, and I also totally could not respect and love and admire my mom more, who made a totally different choice. She also felt she couldn't do both, and she chose to be at home with us kids.
Yeah.
So
I hesitated to ask that question because it's not a question I'd ask a man. But that's where we are, even today in 2023.
Well, I'll turn it back on you.
What was the question?
Are you letting the silence play out?
Oh, yeah. No, quite frankly, I will say that in my head, I know family comes first. But in my heart, my passion is for the job. And, you wrestle with that sometimes.
Yeah.
But have I missed shows because of a child being sick? Or absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that we were talking beforehand, and one of the lines in Mary Louise's book that inspired me was, she said, and you said this in a way just a few minutes ago, about how fun it is that you can talk to anyone in the world. And I never really thought of it that way. But when I read that sentence, I was like, yeah, okay.
Yeah. There's nobody in
expanding my
Pennsylvania not
horizons.
taking your call.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, sorry to cut in on the, okay, go ahead.
So you actually stole my question. So,
Oh, okay.
and you are very conveniently, you have a book right behind you that the title is Men Explain Things to Me. So,
I didn't realize that. Alex, was it that put there in person, in purpose, I should say?
but that was the direction of my question that you already kind of answered. Would you have made different decisions, you think, if you were not a woman? And also, But since this question was partially answered, it's more about a question: how do you think interviewees are treating you because you're a female asking those questions? And one of the example is Mike Pompeo, who probably wouldn't have treated male reporter in that way.
So I'll work my way backward. I have no idea how Mike Pompeo, you know, whether the map test had to do with my being a woman. I will say that after my interview aired and our account of the interview aired, several high-profile reporters in Washington came to me and described similar encounters with him, and at least a couple of them were men, who described being sworn at and berated. So I can't say. I have actually always found being a woman an advantage as an interviewer, and I'm trying to think on why. I think a couple of reasons. One, point to a recent example. My co-host Ari Shapiro, who is a man, was interviewing Nancy Pelosi live when she was speaker. We have non-negotiable posts, we call them. I cannot go a second longer. We have to hit it. If you keep talking, you're just going to get cut off because the local stations are breaking away. So we have no wiggle room. He's interviewing Pelosi live with like less than a minute on the clock. She launches into this really, some like 17-point plan for reforming something. And I can see him like with this look of terror, and he has to interrupt her and cut her off. And he got berated, just absolutely destroyed on social media for mansplaining Pelosi. How dare you? And I think women have a little bit more leeway. I can interrupt Pelosi. I can also interrupt a man, and I will try to do it in as polite a way as I can. And to our earlier conversation, as transparent a way as I can, telling you we only have a few seconds left. Speaker, I got 10 seconds. Lay your best point of 17 on it, But I can cut her off, and I'm not going to be accused of mansplaining. And I cut people off a lot because I have to, because for all of you, I need to get to the next question. I also, I do a lot of reporting overseas, and in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, I can get to half the population that Ari or Steve Inskeep can't get to, because the president will sit down with me, the foreign minister will sit down with me, they will take my questions, but I can then go interview the women, behind the wall, in the kitchen, and just have what is often a way more powerful conversation about, like, so what's for dinner? Do you have enough food? What are your dreams? What are your dreams for your son? What are your dreams for your daughter? Those are conversations my male colleagues cannot have in some parts of the world. And as I have reported from those places, I've been so grateful for my ability to move back and forth and do both.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so this will be our last question.
My question sort of follows the last several minutes of the discussion. I was curious as to your circle of support as you talk about your sons, you talk about your mother helping and your boy's father. And I just was curious to how you were able to pull that all together and make that balance and work for you.
I think I said at the very beginning, most days I'm hanging on by my toenails. And the partial answer is there are just things that don't get done. I am wearing, at the risk of too much information, I was going to wear a dress tonight, but I didn't have time to shave my legs, and something had to give, and so here we are. And there are so many,
That's another thing us men don't have to worry about.
You don't. And it doesn't even look like you shaved up here
No.
either. So, or had to do the makeup or any of it. Totally unfair. There's so many tiny decisions like that of things where I just think it's not all going to get done, so it's not all going to get done. And I did not have time to write a book last year, but I wrote a book last year. You can imagine the cascading things that did not get done and quite how long the hair on my legs was at various stages last year. It is also true, yes, my parents have been phenomenally supportive. I have, and I write about the very close circle of women friends who have held me up. One of whom I have in the room with me tonight. I'm not sure it was her dream when she said, I'm going to be in DC one night, Saturday night. Should we go get a nice dinner? And I said, or we could drive 5 hours round trip to Harrisburg and you could hear me talk about the book again. And she was like, I'm in, let's do it. I have been so fortunate with the female friendships in my life. And I also, just speaking to the bare logistics of it, we have had an army of au pairs and nannies over the years, and I thank them, several of them by name, because it matters. And this would not have gotten done without them. And we moved house at one point to have room to have somebody live in, because my job by definition has often required travel at the very last minute. And my husband traveled a lot as the boys have grown up, and we needed somebody in the house, or even anchoring Morning Edition, to be in the newsroom at 3:30 in the morning, and you hope your kids are safe in bed asleep, but you can't guarantee, like, you need a grown up in the house. And so we had au pairs who lived with us. I wish our German were better after all the Germans who have come through our basement bedroom. It's not a work in progress, but there have been days where if I could have outsourced brushing my teeth, I would have. And I've definitely outsourced more dinners and loads of laundry and, things that needed to get done, and have been very fortunate to have that help. And it wouldn't have gotten done otherwise.
Mary Louise, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to Mary Louise. Thank you to